seen a lot of changes here. It's a fascinating city to live in. When I was growing up, it was not really known for the Colonial Williamsburg restoration. Off of the College of William and Mary, it was better known as the location of Eastern State Hospital for the mentally ill. And in those days, when people talked of going to Williamsburg, they meant something different from what they mean now. A predecessor in my job on city council used to say it was a sleepy little town where 500 lazy lived off of 500 crazy. But it was interesting, in the year I was born, the what is now the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation was founded, inspired by the rector of Bruton Parish Church, John D. Rockefeller Jr., began his work in the restoration of Williamsburg to its appearance in the late 18th century. And that work has gone forward, and in the past 10 years, most of the physical restoration has been completed. But I must say, those days when I was growing up here in the 30s and early 40s were pretty exciting, because there was a lot of detective work going on. The architectural historians were at work, the archaeologists were at work, historical researchers were at work, trying to determine what this city looked like in those days in 1775 and 1776, when Jefferson and Washington and others were here and were creating the great historic documents that are the basis for Virginia's government, and indeed for the government of this whole country. I remember great excitement when word came back from England that a researcher working in the Bodleian Library at Oxford University had discovered a copper plate that showed for the first time the front and rear facades of three of the principal buildings, the Wren building at the college, the Capitol at the opposite end of Duke of Gloucester Street, and the Governor's Palace. It was quite interesting because the archaeologists and the architects who had been working through old insurance records, old historic references, verbal descriptions, had pretty much come up with these buildings looking as they actually did on the Bodleian plate. And the Bodleian plate served to confirm most of the judgments that had been arrived at through other methods of historic detection. Things like that were going on around Williamsburg all the time. Many of the old families, and mine happens to be an old one, were still living in 18th century buildings, or buildings that had started out as 18th century buildings and they'd been added to, and porches had been put on them, and other additions had been made. And it was quite fascinating to see the way the architects, in examining these old buildings, would look at them, and they would scrape down the paint that had been put on them over the generations to get at the original paint colors. They would examine the roofs to see and in many cases find that the old 18th century shingles were still there, or they'd been covered by a tin roof. This sort of thing was going on all over Williamsburg. I remember too that many of the modern, or at least thought to be modern improvements, had to be demolished or moved. The Duke of Gloucester Street was in those days a street of two concrete lanes divided by grass median. The overhead power and telephone lines made a real maze going right down the middle of the street. The city fathers didn't have enough money to keep the grass cut in the median strips, and they were full of trash. But this was all changed. I remember being at my grandmother's house on Duke of Gloucester Street when the equipment came through breaking up the concrete, and all the mirrors and pictures fell off the walls every time the great heavy weight was dropped to break the concrete outdoors. There are many many instances of that. Buildings were moved, businesses were purchased by the Rockefeller interest and relocated in other parts of the city. A new business district was created. It's now called Merchant Square. Many of the old homes were actually physically moved. The Travis House, which is now the headquarters of the research section of Colonial Williamsburg, has in my lifetime been at 3 different locations in the city and was once its most famous restaurant. The fascinating thing about all this was the way people in Williamsburg took all of this activity. For 2 years, they knew that the rector of Bruton Parish Church, who lived on a very meager salary, was going around town buying property and paying cash for them, and they knew he didn't have it. So there was great speculation about who was trying to buy up these historic sites in Williamsburg. And I remember my father, who was associated with Dr. Goodwin in the early days, telling me that he and Dr. Goodwin went to see the editors of the daily papers in Norfolk, Newport News, and Richmond, and explained to them what Dr. Goodwin was trying to do, and even then my father didn't know who tobacco was, but explained what he was trying to do so that the newspapers would not carry a story about it and lead to land speculators coming in and bidding up the prices on property. And the newspapers cooperated in that, so that Dr. Goodwin was able to acquire the principal sites before it was revealed that John D. Rockefeller Jr. was providing the funds. And that information was revealed to the public in Williamsburg at a town meeting about 2 years after Dr. Goodwin started buying the property, and he revealed it. There'd been speculation that perhaps it was Henry Ford, that it was Andrew Carnegie or one of the other important philanthropists. But Dr. Goodwin revealed it, and it prompted a poem by a local wag that starts off, "My God, they've sold the town. My God, they've sold the town."
Virginia. Most people know this state through history textbooks, but the citizens of the state, it is a strange place with even stranger people. Tourists flock here to see homes of presidents and key historic areas. Very few are aware of the disturbing people, places, and events intertwined with the grounds they stand on, admiring the beautiful landscapes, flora, and colonial architecture. The Tidewater region has an especially checkered past. It was where the state began, and although debated by New Englanders, was where the United States of America began. Before settlers arrived here, Native Americans founded their own form of government. Although they were a simple ethnic group, they were very organized, and the tribes operated politically as many countries do today. Needless to say, when the settlers from England arrived here in 1607, they experienced a horrendous introduction from the natives. The Native Americans took advantage of the swampy area where the colonists had settled, where they would sneak up on the colonists, capture them, and inflict sickening forms of torture on them. One of the most well-known incidents between the natives and the colonists was the Indian Massacre of 1622. One evening, the Powhatans, a local tribe, came into the Jamestown settlement seemingly unarmed with good tidings of food. Suddenly, the Powhatan grabbed any tools or weapons available to them and killed any English settlers who were in sight, including men, women, and children of all ages. Wars plagued the Tidewater region for many years, and beyond this, the colonists had a terrible time finding food. Due to the swampy nature of the water surrounding the plantation, it was not sanitary to drink, and the smell was rancid. After many years, the colonists were finally able to adapt to the region, grow food, and overtake the natives. Due to the fires at the State House in Jamestown, it was decided that the capital be established in Williamsburg. Williamsburg truly was the foundation on which the country was founded upon. Many presidents and politicians went to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. It was also the first place politically that affected how the rest of the colonies were governed in colonial days. Because of the integral part Williamsburg played, the area saw many controversial people, places being founded, and events. Although many of the people who inhabited Williamsburg were wealthy politicians, others worked for Eastern State Hospital, the first psychiatric hospital in North America. On October 12, 1773, the public hospital for persons of insane and disordered minds admitted its first patient. Located near the edge of town in a relatively undeveloped section of 18th century Williamsburg, the new institution consisted of 24 cells, an apartment for a living keeper, and a meeting room for the overseeing court of directors. When it opened, the Virginia Hospital was the only public institution exclusively devoted to the care and treatment of the mentally ill in British North America. In a crowded Virginia House of Burgesses meeting in 1766, Francis Farquhar proposed the establishment of the public hospital. He was a very influential royal governor who did not have much trouble getting the institution founded. Beggars, vagrants, the elderly, and the handicapped were kept with other dependent people before the public hospital was founded. In some cases, they were admitted to the local jail to keep them from disturbing the townspeople. The public hospital in Williamsburg was greatly influenced by one of the first mental institutions in Europe, Bethlehem Hospital in London, founded in the 15th century. Bedlam, as it was commonly known, was a very disturbing institution, where patients were treated as cows in a slaughterhouse. It truly was unfortunate that Eastern held Bedlam in such high regard. Therapeutic techniques used by Eastern in the beginning, although at the time considered revolutionary, were very crude and sickening compared to the methods used today. Bleeding instruments, blistering salves, powerful drugs, various water treatments, and restraining devices were employed.
All these little objects that you see here are called scarificators, and there were several ways of letting blood in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And one of the most efficient was the scarificator. It was a spring action mechanism.
Oh, look at that.
With a trigger, and when it was wound up and placed on the patient's arm or leg or wherever blood was supposed to be drawn, the physician would activate the trigger, and the blades would immediately be released and make an immediate incision in the flesh. A scarificator would be used, of course, when you wanted to draw a lot of blood, as opposed to a single blade lancet or a spring action lancet. Normally these mechanisms would have 12 blades.
Wow.
That was the average. Some would have a few less. I think these are probably all 12 blade. Yes, these are all 12 blade scarificators. And
About how old are these?
all these date probably from the late 18th to the mid 19th century. So these mechanisms, in fact, this is an 8-blade scarificator, so this is a little bit smaller. But even during the Civil War, this kind of mechanism would be used for bloodletting.
Although patients were supplied with basic clothing and an adequate diet, rooms were spartanly furnished and organized activities were virtually non-existent. Each patient seems to have spent most of the day and the entire night confined alone in a secured cell measuring approximately 11 feet square. Meals, too, apparently were taken in the cells, but convalescing patients were allowed to spend some daylight time in an outdoors exercise yard called the Mad Yard. The hospital, however, did not provide either benches or shelter in the relatively small fenced area. Conditions were worsened during times of economic or political crisis. It fell into a state of near destitution during the American Revolution. After the war, in November 1786, the hospital was restored to its former glory. Eventually, some psychiatric hospitals across the world were starting to develop a new and improved form of treatment called moral management, where patients were treated with dignity. In adopting this form of treatment, doctors hoped it would not only be an effective form of treatment, but also help the patients be more docile and respect the doctors. It took Eastern State Hospital longer to adapt this new form of treatment, which further drove Williamsburg residents to view the hospital negatively. The moral management system led the Virginia House of Delegates to push for reform in the public hospital in Williamsburg. They sent a committee to view and report on what they saw in the hospital. The report went as follows. The patient's day began at dawn when cells were unlocked. Inmates were cleaned in the morning and then escorted to sitting rooms. Patients spent their daylight hours either in these public rooms or in the privacy of their own cells. Although some of the women residents helped the servants make undergarments, bedding, sheets, and clothing, idleness generally marked the day. Because the staff were scrupulously careful not to compel patients to work, they also failed to encourage them. At mealtimes, the patients ate separately without knives or forks. Hospital personnel claimed they did not provide a common dining table for inmates because the mentally ill preferred to eat in isolation. Shortly before dark, patients were returned to their individual rooms, furnished with a straw mattress on the floor and blankets, and the doors were locked. Servants did not remain in the hospital at night, and therefore residents who had been confined to their cells were left to their own devices. Due to this report, the Virginia House of Delegates recommended that Eastern adopt a treatment plan similar to the moral management system. Slowly but surely, the hospital adapted the moral management system. Through the years, Eastern has evolved to be one of the best psychiatric hospitals in the country. While other hospitals were dropping the moral management system, Eastern was perfecting it. Dr. Tate explains how the hospital has evolved and how the hospital operates today in this interview we conducted with him.
My position here is psychologist, but I have been here 28 years.
Can you tell me a little bit about how Eastern State Hospital has been able to stay at the forefront of patient care while the number of psychiatric hospitals that were founded after Eastern had faded away?
It was probably not so much being at the forefront in the sense of progressive or innovative treatment as much as it was a need, because as you know, at one time in the 60s we had several thousand patients here, although we were designed to hold not more than a few hundred. So statewide patients were sent here and they needed a place to go, and there were only a few state hospitals in Virginia. And so the hospital continued because of that need. So now today it's a different situation. It's, we're about 300 patients, and we do offer state-of-the-art dementia and psychiatric treatment.
Mental health and patient care in general has had a checkered past. How does the current administration of the hospital view the controversy of mental health in the past?
Well, it's kind of like the Germans dealing with the Holocaust. It's been a slow process of admitting that we have a dark side to our history, and that we, in the field of psychiatry and psychology, that we made some horrible mistakes. The reason that it's happened is because we gave a few male physicians incredible power and authority. That is unlikely to happen again because we have new ethical rules and guidelines in both medical and psychiatric professions, and the Psychological Association and even the nursing associations. We have what what is now empirical research. So somebody like Dr. Freeman, who was doing lobotomies, can't say patients are getting better, and that's accepted. It has to be demonstrated through empirical research, any type of treatment. We also have, of course, a research and bioethics committee, so any type of human research that's conducted here at the hospital goes through a very, very tight review and is under the microscope for how it might affect adversely our patients. We have a whole new system where there are patient advocates and complaint systems, and we've moved somewhat away from a medical model to a recovery model, which gives more autonomy to patients. So that's how we've overcome the errors of the past and how we're making sure that they are not repeated in the future.
What types of elements are characteristic of most of Eastern's patients, if you can speak on that?
Well, it's very general. Here they're all inpatient. They're all adults. They have to be a minimum of age 18. At one time we did have a child and adolescent unit, but that was moved to Staunton probably 15 years ago or so. So our youngest patient is 18. Our oldest would probably be 102 in the geriatric building. The average stay would be 3 to 6 months, but that is only an average. Some people come in, get stabilized on medication, and they're out in a couple of weeks. Other people are here for years. We have some patients in geriatrics who have been here all their lives and probably will be here the rest of their lives because of, in the earlier days, discharge was not a priority like it is today. And at the turn of the century, when people came into psych hospitals, they were there for life. There was no discharge. Today, of course, we start discharge processing the second somebody walks through our door. The average, the primary diagnosis, as you know, is probably schizophrenia. Bipolar disorder would run a very close second. There isn't any diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that isn't represented here. We have every diagnosis there is. Schizophrenia is just the most common. And we have probably, I would say, 70% of our patients are dual diagnosed with alcohol or drug abuse or addiction problems.
And one question that I think is different among many psychiatric hospitals or how they handle this is, are patients allowed to, enjoy entertainment such as watching TV or listening to music?
Oh, absolutely. And I can't imagine today that any hospital wouldn't allow that. I mean, we have a library, we have computers where the clients are online. On some units, if people are not suicidal or self-injurious, they can have iPods. There are 4 TVs alone on my unit. Each pod, which has 5 patients, has its own TV. We have art groups, we have art therapy, we have music therapists, we have dance and movement groups. At one time we had psychodrama. We don't currently have that. And I'm actually working on equine therapy to get horseback riding groups started. So clients have an incredible amount of access to media, to materials, and to treatment even in the community. That's standard practice in our hospital. We have our largest department is the rehab department. We have a full gymnasium here. We have an indoor swimming pool. Some patients even go off grounds to the recreation center that the people in the community use. Patients with certain levels at the end of the day can go out of the building and jog. I know 3 or 4 patients who are runners. We have all levels of groups, so even our patients with disabilities and patients who are in wheelchairs still have physical activity. We have an exercise room filled with state-of-the-art elliptical and equipment, and patients are encouraged to participate in those activities. And we have a basketball team.
Over Over the years, how has the general community of Williamsburg viewed the hospital?
Well, it depends who you talk to. That's a hard question to answer. The media, especially the Daily Press and the Gazette, seem to have very subjective ideas about the hospital. Their reporting is often inaccurate and sensational. Of course, we're not allowed to respond because that would be a HIPAA violation, or there are sometimes situations that we can't comment on because of patient confidentiality, so we're not always allowed to challenge that. So the view of the hospital in the media has been untrue and unfair. An example, we recently had a client who committed murder, and they interviewed him while he was in jail before he came to the hospital. And the episode on the TV had a picture of, quote, Eastern State Hospital, and they had a barbed wire fence with a padlock on it. We have no barbed wire anywhere at Eastern State Hospital, and we definitely don't have padlocks on gates and doors. So that type of misinformation gets out into the community and colors the perception. I think there's still stigma with mental health nationwide, not just in Williamsburg and Virginia, but a lot of locals have worked at Eastern State. They have had family who's worked here. They've had family members who've been patients. They know those of us who work here. We do more outreach. We do more lectures. We now have grocery stores that hire our patients for bagging and stocking. So the perception has improved over the years.
Although the hospital had a checkered past, the administration is focused now on helping the patient feel comfortable and help them lead better lives than they might have without effective treatment. Because of the stigma mental institutions have gotten over the years, it has been very hard for Eastern to convince prospective patients that it's not some medieval jail where patients are forced to undergo crazy tests by even crazier doctors. Eastern State Hospital in today's age does not operate like this. They have been very open with us about the dark history of the institution, which is rare among mental institution administrations. The local news stations in the area print sensationalist stories about Eastern, which makes it very difficult for the hospital to help prospective patients.
Watching this ad on TV for Colonial Williamsburg. Has anybody been there? Have you been there before in Virginia?
Yes, yeah. It's a recreation of a 18th, 19th century town.
Yes.